The blood law had not been invoked in 300 years, and tonight it was going to demand a life. Amara Sable stood at the center of the Valemont court's inner sanctum, a vast underground chamber carved from black marble and candlelight, and she did not flinch. She had spent the last 4 months learning not to flinch, not when the vampires watched her with those pale, unreadable eyes, not when the air tasted of old power and older grudges, not when the crimson-sealed scroll had been unrolled across the obsidian altar and every vampire noble in the room had turned to look at her with expressions that ranged from pity to hunger. She was the Sable heiress. She had not survived her father's assassination, her mother's disappearance, and 2 attempted coups against the Sable financial empire by learning to flinch. The ancient vow is clear. Counselor Zephyrin's voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He was tall, chalk-pale even by vampire standards, with silver hair that fell in long, loose ropes past his shoulders and eyes the color of old ice. He had been alive for 6 centuries, and he wore that age like a crown no one had officially given him. When the blood compact between the Valemont line and the mortal house of Sable was established, it required renewal every century. The last renewal was performed by Amara Sable in 1923. She offered a Sable heir to the court as symbolic sacrifice, a night's surrender of will and blood to seal the agreement. Tonight the century expires. The law requires the same. The law, Amara said, her voice steady, requires a mortal sacrifice, not a murder. There is a distinction that may be academic by morning. Zephyrin replied, and several of the assembled nobles laughed softly, the sound like silk over broken glass. Enough. The single word came from the far end of the chamber, from the raised day where Balthazar Valemont had been sitting still as carved stone since the proceedings began. He rose now, and the room changed. It was not a dramatic transformation, no lightning, no supernatural surge of cold, but every vampire in that chamber shifted, unconsciously orienting toward him, the way compass needles swing north. He was over 6 feet tall, with white hair that fell to his jaw, sharp and immaculate, and skin so pale it seemed almost luminous in the candlelight. His eyes were dark gray, the color of storm clouds over a winter sea, and they were fixed entirely on Amara. Balthazar Valemont was the oldest of the Valemont line still living. He was not the kind of man who needed a title to make a room go quiet. He was the kind of man the title had been invented to approximate. "Counselor Zephyrin," he said, descending the dais steps with the unhurried grace of someone who had never needed to rush toward anything in his entire immortal life. "You will not laugh at my guest again." The chamber went very still. Zephyrin inclined his head. "Of course, my lord. I meant no disrespect to the heiress." "You meant exactly that." Balthazar stopped beside Amara, close enough that she could feel the strange coolness that radiated from him. Not cold like a draft, but cool like marble, like deep water, like something ancient and composed. He did not look at her yet. He kept his eyes on the council. "The vow will be honored, but I will hear Miss Sable's terms before any decision is finalized." "Her terms?" Zephyrin's composed expression cracked, just slightly, around the edges. "My lord, the ancient vow does not negotiate with mortals." "The ancient vow," Balthazar said, his voice dropping to something soft and terrifyingly precise, "was written by my ancestor, witnessed by my bloodline, and governed by my court. The ancient vow negotiates with whoever I say it negotiates with." He finally turned to look at Amara, and his eyes, up close, were more complicated than she had expected. There was steel in them, yes, and power, and that particular quality of cold authority that centuries of rulership creates. But there was also something else, something watchful and careful, and perhaps, she thought, very slightly worried. "Miss Sable, I believe you came here tonight with something to say." She had been waiting for exactly this moment. She had prepared for it. She pulled the folded document from inside her jacket. Modern paper, not parchment, because she had decided deliberately to present herself as what she was, and placed it on the altar beside the ancient scroll. The Sable Compact was built on 3 foundations, she said. Blood, protection, and commerce. My ancestor offered a night of surrender because in 1923, that was the only currency she had. She was a woman alone, recently widowed, protecting a company and a bloodline she'd inherited without preparation. She gave what she had. Amara looked around the room, meeting eyes, not flinching from any of them. I am not her. I am offering something worth considerably more than a symbolic night of submission. I am offering a living partnership. The silence that followed was different from the one Balthazar had created. That one had been controlled, deliberate. This one was raw and uncertain. What I have drafted, Amara continued, her hand resting flat on the paper she had placed on the altar, is a renewed covenant between Sable Industries and the Valemont court. Legal protections in the mortal world that your court cannot currently access. Shell companies, medical research facilities, import channels that move materials across 9 international borders without inspection. Daylight business conducted by people who trust the Sable name. In exchange, the Valemont court extends its protection to the Sable line, not symbolically, not for one night, but permanently and actively. She paused. No blood, no surrender of will. A partnership between equals. She is not our equal, someone from the back of the chamber said. Balthazar's head turned with the slow, predatory precision of something that did not need to hurry because it had never, in all its long existence, failed to reach its target. Who said that? No one answered. He let the silence hold for 5 full seconds, she counted. Before he turned back to the altar, picked up her document, and began to read. That was 4 months ago. This is how Amara Sable came to be standing in a vampire court in the first place, on the night everything she thought she understood about the world cracked open like old stone. Her father, Edmund Sable, had been found dead in his private office on the 38th floor of Sable Tower on a Tuesday morning in March. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. Amara, who had grown up watching her father run 6 miles before breakfast and refuse anything that had more than 4 grams of saturated fat, had not believed that for a single moment. The police, who were being quietly influenced by parties she could not yet identify, had closed the investigation within 2 weeks. She had inherited everything, the company, the assets, the board seats, and, crucially, a locked mahogany box that had been in her father's desk, addressed in his handwriting to her name, with the instruction, "Open only if I am gone and you cannot find me." Inside the box was a key, a short letter in her father's careful hand, and a name, Balthazar Valemont. Her father's letter had been direct because Edmund Sable had been a direct man who believed that clarity was a form of love. He had explained, in 3 paragraphs, that vampires were real, that the Sable family had been under the protection of the Valemont court for over a century, that the protection had lapsed when Amara's grandfather had decided the whole arrangement was superstitious nonsense and stopped paying the quarterly tribute, and that Edmund had spent the last decade trying to quietly re-establish contact because he had come to believe, with growing certainty, that something was hunting the Sable family. He had not had time to finish. The key opened a safe deposit box at a private bank in Mayfair. Inside was enough documentation of the original compact, photographs, translated copies, correspondence in languages Amara had needed to have translated to establish that the agreement was real, the court was real, and that the name Balthazar Valemont appeared in documents spanning nearly 2 centuries without any indication of aging or replacement. She had spent 3 weeks not sleeping, doing research, and coming very close to deciding her father had lost his mind before the second attempt on her life confirmed that, whatever else was happening, something genuinely supernatural was involved. The man who had been sent to kill her in her own kitchen at 2 in the morning had not been entirely human. She had only survived because she had not been where she was supposed to be, and because she had been raised by a man who believed his daughter should know how to handle herself in any room she walked into. She had broken his wrist with a marble rolling pin and gotten out of the house before he recovered. And in the bruised, shaking aftermath of that night, she had decided that the supernatural was a workable variable. She had dealt with hostile board members. She had dealt with corporate espionage and hostile takeovers and an ex-boyfriend who had tried to leak private information to a competitor. She could deal with vampires. She had found the court the way her father's letter had directed, through an old address in Knightsbridge, through a door that looked like solid brick, until you pressed the iron ring embedded in the mortar at precisely the right angle, through a descending staircase that went down further than any basement should logically go, and into a world that smelled of beeswax and cold stone and something old and alive and utterly unlike anything she had encountered before. She had been intercepted immediately, of course. 2 guards whose stillness was absolute and whose eyes tracked her like something hunting, who had brought her not to a cell or an interrogation room, but, surprisingly, to a drawing room with genuine Regency furniture and a fire that was burning despite the absence of any visible chimney. She had been left there for 45 minutes, which she assumed was deliberate. She had used the time to read the framed documents on the walls and catalogue everything she could see. When Balthazar Valemont had entered the room, she had been standing at the fireplace reading a letter framed in glass on the mantelpiece, and she had not immediately turned around. "That is correspondence between my court and the East India Company," he had said, his voice entering the room before he did, low and precise and carrying the kind of natural authority that did not need volume to fill space. "From 1782, I would prefer you not touch the frame. I was not touching the frame." She had turned then, and the shock of looking at him had been physical, not because of fear, though fear would have been a reasonable response, but because of the sheer unreality of him. He was exactly what he was. There was no trying to approximate humanity in the way he stood, in the particular quality of his stillness, in the color of him, all white and gray and dark, like something out of an old painting that had stepped off its canvas and was quietly unimpressed by the century it had arrived in. "I am Amara Sable. I believe you knew my father." He had studied her with those storm cloud eyes for a long moment. "I knew your grandfather's father," he had said. "Your grandfather made it clear that the Sable family no longer wished to maintain our arrangement. Your father attempted to reach me twice. I was not available." "He is dead." Something had moved in those grey eyes. Not guilt, exactly, but something in the territory. "I know. When did you find the box?" That had been the moment she understood he had known about the box, which meant her father had told him about it, which meant there had been more recent contact than the letter had suggested. She had filed that away and answered his question with one of her own. "You knew he was in danger." Balthazar had not flinched either. They were, she had thought, perhaps more similar in that specific quality than the rest of their natures would suggest. "I suspected. I was attempting to verify before taking action that would have constituted an interference in mortal affairs without invitation, which is prohibited under the same ancient codes that govern the compact. Your father understood this. He was gathering evidence that would have constituted the formal invitation I required. He ran out of time." "Yes." A pause. "Wes, I am sorry for that, Miss Sable." Genuinely, she had believed him. That had been the first surprise. The compact negotiations had taken 3 days. Balthazar had been a difficult and exacting counterpart, and she had found that she respected him for it. He had not underestimated her. He had pushed back on 3 of her proposed terms with counter-arguments that were precise, legally sophisticated, and took into account factors she had not initially considered. She had revised. He had revised. By the end of the 3rd day, they had something that neither of them had come in expecting to build, a working document. Then Zephyrin had invoked the ancient vow and attempted to override the entire negotiation by appealing to blood law, and Amara had walked into the inner sanctum and laid her revised terms on an obsidian altar. and Balthazar had read them in front of his court and said, quietly, that the lady had a point. The 4 months since had been, by any reasonable measure, the most extraordinary of her life. She had a suite of rooms in the Valemont Court's upper level, the portion that occupied the upper floors of an old Georgian townhouse in Mayfair, invisible from the street by a combination of genuine architecture, and something she still did not fully understand, a kind of layered glamour that made mortal eyes simply slide past the entrance without registering it. She also kept her apartment and her office at Sable Tower, because the company still needed running and the mortal world still had a morning which the court's permanent residents largely ignored. She had negotiated her own freedom of movement as one of the compact's explicit terms. The Sable Heiress would not be a court ward or a kept mortal or any of the historical categories the vampire aristocracy had used to classify their human affiliates. She was a partner. She came and went as she chose. She attended court functions when it suited the compact's needs. She had her own counsel, her own security, and the explicit right to refuse any request that was not within the compact's agreed terms. Balthazar had agreed to all of it without complaint, which had surprised the council enormously and surprised her moderately. She had expected a fight. Instead, he had simply said, "The lady's autonomy is not negotiable," and moved on to the next clause. She had not known what to do with that, initially. He was not easy to know. He was not designed for easy. He was 6 centuries of accumulated complexity and habitual solitude, and the particular kind of guardedness that develops when you have watched everyone you have ever known die of old age while you remain. He was also, she discovered gradually, funny in a dry and oblique way that caught her off guard the first several times before she learned to listen for it. He read voraciously and had opinions about modern literature that were occasionally scathing and occasionally unexpectedly tender. He played piano very well when he thought no one was listening. He was meticulous about everything, his appearance, his obligations, the keeping of his word, in a way that she recognized because she was the same, and which she suspected came from the same root cause. If you could not trust the world to hold still, you held yourself still instead. She had found herself staying in the court for longer and longer stretches. She had told herself it was the research. There was genuinely useful research. Her father's death remained unsolved, and the entity that had sent the man to her kitchen that night was still unidentified, and Balthazar had made it clear that his court's intelligence suggested the threat was old, organized, and connected to something that predated even the original Sable Compact. She had told herself it was the safety. The court was, factually, the safest place she had ever been. Anything that attempted to reach her here would be walking into a building full of apex predators who had a contractual obligation to keep her alive. She had told herself these things for approximately 2.5 months before she had been sitting across from Balthazar in his private library at 2 a.m, both of them working, the fire burning between them and a pot of tea on her side of the desk that he had ordered for her without being asked, because he had noticed she always wanted tea at 2 a.m, and she had looked up from her work and looked at him and understood, with the same quiet certainty she used for all the most important decisions of her life, that the honest explanation was none of the above. She stuffik of him. That realization had not been comfortable. It had not been designed to be. He was not human, and she was not naive, and the distance between their natures was not a small thing to overlook. She had made a list because she was Amara Sable, and she made lists of every practical and emotional complication involved in whatever she was feeling, and the list had been long and specific and had not changed a single thing she felt when he walked into a room. She had said nothing. She was good at saying nothing when saying something would be premature. She had simply continued to work beside him and argue with him about compact clauses and refuse to be intimidated by his court, and drink her tea at 2 a.m and wait. with the patience she had learned from watching her father negotiate for the right moment. The right moment arrived unexpectedly, as right moments usually do, in the form of a crisis. Zephyrin had not accepted defeat gracefully. She had understood this from the beginning, the way you understand a mathematical axiom, not because you feel it, but because the logic is inescapable. A man who had built 6 centuries of influence around the enforcement of blood law and the traditional subordination of mortal affiliates was not going to quietly accept a human woman rewriting the terms. He would wait. He would look for leverage. He found it in her father's murder. She was in the court's archive room, a long, low space beneath the townhouse's east wing, lined with shelves of documents and objects that collectively represented the history of the Valemont court across 8 centuries, when Sebastian, one of Balthazar's younger lieutenants, found her and told her that Zephyrin had called an emergency council session and had produced evidence that Edmund Sable's death was not the work of an external enemy, but had been arranged by a mortal agent working on behalf of a Sable board member who had been colluding with a rival vampire faction for 3 years. The rival faction wanted the Sable compact voided, wanted the Sable assets absorbed into their own network, had already moved on 2 Sable subsidiary companies and planted a board member, a man named Reeve, whom she had suspected but never been able to prove, to shepherd the company into their hands. But Zephyrin's emergency council session was not about justice. Zephyrin's council session was about using this information as the grounds to declare the Sable Compact invalid, on the basis that the Sable line had been compromised by mortal treachery, which under the old codes technically released the court from its protection obligation and restored the original terms of the ancient vow, which required, since the century renewal was still technically in its grace period under Zephyrin's reading of the law, a blood sacrifice after all. Amara had walked into that council session and sat down in the chair reserved for compact partners without being invited, while Zephyrin was still mid-sentence presenting his case, and she had said, loudly and clearly enough that every vampire in the room could hear, "You cannot void a contract because a third party attempted to undermine it without the primary party's knowledge or consent. I did not collude with anyone. My father did not collude with anyone. We are the victims of the collusion, not the architects of it. If anything, the existence of a coordinated attempt to destroy the Sable Compact is evidence that the compact matters enough to be worth targeting, which is a stronger argument for its renewal than anything I put in my document." Zephyrin had gone still with a kind of fury that made the temperature in the room drop. Then he had said something that was not an argument. It was a threat, and it was directed not at the compact, but at her specifically, and it was the kind of threat that carried weight, because the man making it had 6 centuries of knowing exactly how to hurt people in ways that were not technically against the laws of his court. "The mortal woman is unprotected at this moment," he said softly. "The compact is under review. The Lord's personal protection does not extend beyond the compact's terms until the compact is ratified. It would be a shame if she were to encounter an accident in this room, in front of witnesses who all happen to have rather poor memories for detail." The silence that followed was absolute. Amara held very still. And then Balthazar was between her and Zephyrin, and she had not seen him move, which was something she had understood intellectually was possible, but had not viscerally experienced until this moment. One moment he had been across the room, the next he was simply present, standing between her and the threat with a quality of stillness that was the opposite of peaceful. "Touch her," Balthazar said, in a voice so quiet it barely qualified as sound, "and I will personally show you why the ancient vow was written with my bloodline's name at the top and not yours. You cannot invoke personal protection outside the compact's ratified terms. You said yourself. I said the compact's protection does not extend beyond its ratified terms." Balthazar's voice was the same quiet, precise, devastating register. I said nothing about my personal disposition toward anyone who threatens a guest in my court. The compact is a document. What I am is considerably older than any document. He turned to the rest of the council, and his eyes were dark and absolutely certain. The compact will be ratified tonight. The information Councillor Zephyrin has presented regarding the Sable board member will be acted upon through the appropriate channels with the appropriate involvement of the Heiress as primary affected party. Reeve will be dealt with. His gaze returned to Zephyrin. And you will sit down. Zephyrin sat. Afterward, in the corridor outside the council chamber, Amara had stopped walking and simply stood still for a moment, absorbing the fact that her hands were shaking. She had been genuinely afraid in that room. She knew how to function under fear, had done it before, but it was still fear. And she was not going to pretend otherwise just because pretending would have been easier. She heard Balthazar's footsteps behind her. He stopped a few feet away, and there was a silence between them that was different from the usual quality of his silences. This one had something exposed in it. "Are you injured?" he asked. "No," she unclenched her hands deliberately. "Scared, but no." "You should have waited in the archive room. What Sebastian told you was not an invitation to enter the council chamber. I know. You walked into a room full of hostile vampires without a formal protection status in effect, in the middle of a council session, specifically designed to strip your rights. You had no guarantee I would arrive before something happened. I know that too." She turned to look at him. He was very close, and he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something concentrated and almost raw, like a carefully maintained wall that has developed a significant crack. "But I was right, wasn't I? Legally and logically, my argument was correct." A pause. "Your argument was impeccable. Your timing was dangerous. Dangerous and effective. Amara," he said her name. And the way he said it was different from how he had said it in front of the council. Different from the professional and careful register of 4 months of compact negotiations. There was something underneath the word. Something that had been there, she suspected, for longer than either of them had explicitly acknowledged. If something had happened to you in that room, then the compact would have been void anyway, and you would have had considerably more justification for what you were clearly about to do to Zephyrin. I am not talking about the compact. She had known he would say it eventually, and she had been ready for it, and still it hit her somewhere, deep and warm and vulnerable and entirely undefended. "Neither am I," she said quietly. The corridor was long and lit with the same beeswax candle arrangement that seemed to characterize the court's aesthetic choices, and it smelled of stone and old wood and the particular clean cold quality that surrounded him, and she watched him work through whatever internal recalibration was required for a man who had governed his own feelings with iron precision for 6 centuries to acknowledge that the precision had slipped. "This is not simple," he said finally. "I know. The complications are not trivial. What I am, what you are, Balthazar." She used his name the way he had used hers, deliberately, with the full weight of everything that had accumulated between them in 4 months of proximity and argument, and 2 in the morning tea, and watching him play piano when he thought no one was listening. "I did not survive my father's murder and 2 attempts on my life, and a hostile compact negotiation, and Zephyrin's 6th-century grudge because I am afraid of complicated." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile. It was something deeper than a smile, something that did not get used as often as a smile and was therefore more honest. "No," he said softly. "You are not afraid of anything. That is absolutely not true. I was afraid 10 minutes ago, and yet you walked into the room, and yet I walked into the room." He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelit corridor, and then he reached out and took her hand, which he had never done before, and held it with a careful, deliberate gentleness that felt like the most considered decision he had made in decades. "Stay," he said. "Not a command. Not a lord's decree." Just a request, from a man who had learned to ask for very little. I was already staying, she told him. They dealt with Reeve the following week, and it was not pleasant, but it was thorough. Balthazar provided intelligence through the court's network that Amara's legal team used to build a case that went to the Financial Conduct Authority and 3 separate law enforcement agencies across 2 countries. Reeve, confronted with evidence of market manipulation, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit murder, confessed to everything in exchange for a reduced sentence, including the identity of the rival vampire faction that had hired him. The rival faction was called the Morn Court. They were older than Amara had expected, a fragmented remnant of a pre-existing network that had been in conflict with the Valemont line since the 18th century, operating in the gaps between legitimate vampire courts and the mortal world's unknowing institutions. They had been responsible for Edmund Sable's death. They had been responsible for both attempts on Amara's life. Balthazar's response to this intelligence was precise and cold and completely characteristic of him. He called 3 allied courts, presented the evidence, and invoked an article of vampire inter-court law that permitted formal dissolution of an illegitimate faction that had engaged in unprovoked aggression against a protected compact partner. It was not a war. He had explained to Amara carefully that she deserved to know what was happening and why. It was a formal enforcement proceeding, the equivalent of a very old and very binding international legal mechanism, enforced by entities that had been maintaining the framework of supernatural governance since before most modern nations existed. The Morn Court was dissolved within a month. Its senior members scattered. The mortal agents were turned over to human authorities. The threat that had been hunting the Sable family was, finally, ended. On the night Balthazar told her it was over, she was in his library again, as she had been on so many nights, and the fire was burning, and there was tea on her side of the desk. And he said it simply and directly. It is finished. The Sable line is safe. And something that she had been carrying at a low constant tension since March cracked open and released. She cried, briefly and without any intention to do so, which was the only way she ever cried. He moved from his side of the desk to hers and sat beside her without being asked and put his arm around her without preamble. And she leaned into the particular cool stillness of him and let herself feel, for a few minutes, the full weight of everything she had been managing at a controlled distance for 7 months. He would have been proud of you, Balthazar said quietly. He had known Edmund Sable in whatever limited capacity their last-minute contact had permitted. He said it as if he meant it precisely. He was proud of me anyway, she said, which was true and which she had always known and which hurt in its own particular way. He would have liked knowing the court was involved. He believed in this. Your grandfather did not. My grandfather was wrong about a lot of things. She straightened, and he did not remove his arm, and she did not move away from it. My grandfather thought that anything he could not explain in conventional terms was not worth taking seriously. My father understood that the world is larger than conventional terms. A pause. So do I. Balthazar looked at her, and she had learned by now to read him. The surface composure, and below it the careful, complex, intensely guarded truth of what he actually felt, and what she saw in him was something that she thought, with the particular precision she trusted most, was the closest thing to joy he currently knew how to show. The compact's ratification ceremony is scheduled for next week, he said. I know. I reviewed the ceremonial protocols this morning. There is an older tradition, he said slowly, that accompanies compact renewals between the Valemont court and its mortal partners. It is not required under the terms you negotiated. I did not include it in the formal documentation because it is not a legal matter. She turned to look at him. What tradition? A personal acknowledgement between the head of the court and the head of the mortal house. Historically, it has taken various forms. In some centuries, it was a formal oath. In others, a shared meal. which in our case would be somewhat asymmetrical, the faintest trace of the oblique humor she had learned to listen for. The tradition's core is simply this, a public statement, before both parties' representatives, that the relationship is one of genuine mutual regard rather than merely contractual obligation. And you are telling me about this optional tradition because, he said carefully, I would like to invoke it. If you are willing, she considered him. The white hair, the storm-colored eyes, the centuries of accumulated solitude and governance and loss all held in that composed, careful, beautiful face, the arms still around her shoulders, the tea he ordered every night without being asked, the piano playing when he thought no one was listening, the way he had moved between her and Zephyrin without a moment's hesitation and said what he was with more certainty than most people lived their entire lives achieving. I am willing, she said. The ratification ceremony was held in the grand hall, the large, formal chamber one level above the inner sanctum, which had carved stone ceilings and tall windows that looked out on a walled garden, and which was, Amara had always thought, the most beautiful room she had ever been in. The council was assembled, including Zephyrin, who had accepted his defeat in the only way a man of his nature could accept it, which was to say he had not accepted it emotionally, but had acknowledged it structurally. And there was a contingent of Sable Industries' most trusted senior staff, who had been given a carefully structured and partially complete explanation of the court and the compact, and who were, to their considerable credit, managing the information with the same practical adaptability Amara had counted on when she selected them. The formal terms were read. The document was signed in a ceremony that Amara had helped design to be meaningfully hybrid, some elements drawn from the court's ancient protocols, some from modern legal practice, because she was not going to pretend to be something she was not, and she did not expect him to either. The compact was ratified, sealed in both the mortal world sense and the supernatural one, which involved a formality she had been prepared for in advance, and which was less alarming than she had anticipated. Brief and very precisely managed exchange of blood that was more symbolic than physical, and which Balthazar had been intensely specific about. Every detail controlled, nothing left to chance. Then the formal ceremony was concluded, and Balthazar stepped forward, and the room changed the way it always changed when he commanded its full attention. He spoke to the assembled court in the old language first, which she did not fully understand, but which Sebastian had told her translated roughly as, I acknowledge before this court and by my blood and name that what is spoken next is truth and freely given. Then he switched to English, which was characteristic of him. He did not hide important things in languages she could not follow. I have governed this court for five centuries, he said, and I have renewed the Sable Compact twice in that time, and I have never before had cause to say that the compact was something I valued for its own sake rather than for the obligations it fulfilled. What Amara Sable brought to this court was not merely a revised document. It was a demonstration that the old forms can be remade into something better, and that intelligence and courage are not diminished by being mortal. He paused, and the pause had the same quality as all his most important silences, full and considered and absolutely sincere. She has my regard. She has my protection. She has, if she will accept it, my personal acknowledgement that the relationship between us is not, and has never been, merely a matter of contract. He turned from the court to her, which was the part that made her breath catch, not from fear or uncertainty, but from the full, present, undeniable weight of it. This moment, this person, this exact and unrepeatable thing, she had prepared her own words. She had written them out, revised them, thrown out the first 3 drafts, and arrived at something that said what she actually meant rather than what sounded right. I came to this court to honor a vow my family made and to protect what my father left me, she said. I negotiated the terms I negotiated because I believe that any agreement worth keeping should be one both parties genuinely choose. I am still human. I am still mortal. I am still the heiress of a company and a family and a set of obligations I did not ask for and would not give back. Those things do not change. She held his gaze. But I am also a person who walks into rooms she was not invited into when she has something true to say. And the true thing I have to say, in front of your court and my staff, and the old vow and all the centuries between us, is that I choose this, freely with full knowledge of what it is. I choose the partnership. I choose the court. A pause. I choose you. Zephyryn's expression, she noted in her peripheral vision, was a remarkable study in the architecture of a man trying very hard not to feel anything obvious. Several of the other council members looked moved in spite of themselves. Sebastian, who was 23 in vampire years, and therefore retained an endearing residual capacity for open emotion, looked genuinely delighted. Balthazar crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands, which were cool and careful and utterly certain, and kissed her in front of the entire assembled court with the same deliberate precision he brought to every important thing he did, considered, honest, and absolutely without reservation. The court, to her considerable satisfaction, applauded. There was a great deal of practical complexity that followed, as there is always practical complexity when the life you are living shifts into new territory. They negotiated it the way they negotiated everything, directly, with full acknowledgement of the obvious problems, and with the particular fluency of two people who had already proven they could build something together under adversarial conditions. The question of her mortality was the one she had expected him to raise, and he did. 3 weeks after the ratification ceremony, on a night when they were walking in the walled garden behind the court, one of the spaces she had claimed as particularly her own, because it was full of growing things and she liked growing things, and because the contrast between the living garden and the stone court felt important to her in a way she did not always have words for. There are mechanisms, he said, walking beside her with his hands clasped behind his back, which was how he walked when he was thinking carefully about what he was about to say. That would address the disparity. In time. When you chose, you mean the conversion. Yes. He did not elaborate. He was, she had come to understand, constitutionally opposed to manipulating her through information withholding or emotional pressure. If she wanted to know something, he would tell her. He did not push. I have thought about it, she said, and I am 28 years old. She stopped beside the rose arbor, which in autumn was all stripped-back canes and bare structure, beautiful in the spare way of things that show you their bones. I am not going to make that decision at 28. No, he agreed immediately, because he understood this completely. I am also not going to pretend the question does not exist, or that it is not something we will eventually need to revisit. She turned to look at him. I am going to live my life. I am going to run my company and have complicated arguments with your council, and continue to negotiate things that supposedly cannot be negotiated. And somewhere in the future, when I am ready, we will have a different conversation. Yes, he said. And the way he said it was so perfectly calm and certain and patient that she felt something in her chest that was not describable in conventional business terms. You have been waiting 6 centuries, she said. A few more decades is nothing to you. It is not nothing. His voice was quiet. Nothing about you is nothing. He stepped closer, and his hand came up to tuck a strand of dark hair behind her ear with the careful, deliberate tenderness he reserved for moments when he was being most fully himself, unguarded, unhurried, honest. But you are right. The decision is yours to make in your own time. I will be here, I know, she said. That's the part that makes it possible to not be afraid of it. Winter came to the court gradually, and then all at once, the way it always does in London, the city pressing in around the Georgian townhouse, with its noise and its lights and its relentless mortal pace, and inside the court the candles burned, and the fires burned, and Amara's tea was ready at 2 in the morning, and the piano played in the music room on nights when Balthazar believed himself unobserved, which he no longer actually was, because she had learned his habits and had started arriving in the music room's doorway, a few minutes into the performance, and sitting in the chair by the door and listening without interrupting. He had noticed her presence the third time. She was certain of it, but he had not stopped playing, which she took as a form of invitation that suited both of them. The Sable Compact's first year of operation was, by any commercial measure, an extraordinary success. The channels she had negotiated moved materials through 9 international borders with a precision and reliability that generated returns which made the board meeting, where she had presented the preliminary results, in somewhat abstracted terms, genuinely memorable. Reeves' conviction had cleaned the board of its most dangerous element. She promoted 2 people who had been systematically overlooked under the old structure. She hired a COO who reminded her of herself 5 years ago, sharp and hungry, and not yet afraid of the things that should be feared, and spent 6 months teaching her how to run toward problems instead of away. The court, for its part, experienced its own series of changes. Zephyrin's formal influence contracted, not because Balthazar punished him. That was not the way he operated, and punishment without cause was not something she would have been comfortable with regardless, but because the compact's success made Zephyrin's position, which had always been essentially about maintaining the old systems, demonstrably untenable. The court was stronger with the revised partnership. The numbers, even in supernatural politics, did not lie. Sebastian became, over the course of that first year, something that surprised Amara, a genuine friend. Not the uncomplicated kind, but the interesting kind, the kind that comes from 2 people with genuinely different natures and experiences, finding common ground in curiosity and a shared tendency to ask uncomfortable questions out loud. He was curious about the mortal world in a way that was genuine rather than predatory, and she answered his questions with the same directness she brought to everything. And he told her things about court history and vampire culture that her compact research had not covered, things that were personal rather than political, and it added a texture to her understanding of this world that she had not expected. She found herself understanding more deeply over time what it meant to exist in the court as a human woman, not as a ward or a dependent or a blood resource or a symbol, but as herself, complicated and capable and mortal and present. There were still vampires who looked at her with the particular flatness that meant they had not updated their category system to include her. She did not take it personally. She simply continued to exist in the room and do whatever she had come to do. And over time, the category systems in question updated whether their owners intended them to or not. The Morn Court's dissolution had not eliminated all the splinters of its network. They had expected this, and Balthazar's intelligence apparatus, a formidable thing, 6 centuries of accumulated contacts and methods and a particularly gifted network of mortal informants who worked inside institutions the vampire court could not access directly, tracked the remnants with patient thoroughness. There were 2 further incidents, neither of them as dangerous as the attempts the previous year. Both of them managed and resolved without permanent harm to either Amara or the compact. The second one had involved a direct attempt to compromise one of her trusted Sable staff members, which had made her furious in a way she found clarifying. The anger was clean and specific and directed her toward the solution efficiently. "You deal with anger well," Balthazar had observed during the aftermath of the second incident. "I don't deal with it well," she had replied. "I just don't let it make my decisions." "That," he had said, "is what dealing with it well means." She had laughed, which was something she did more in his presence than almost anywhere else, and he had looked at her with the particular expression she had catalogued carefully over 12 months of observation. The one that happened when she did something that surprised him, not because it was unexpected in terms of her character, but because he still, apparently, had not fully accounted for the degree to which her presence in a room changed his experience of the room. She told him that she loved him for the first time on a Thursday night in November in his library, not because she had planned to say it on that night specifically, but because he had been reading to her from a history he'd found in the archive. Reading it aloud because she'd complained that his handwriting was illegible in the original, and it was easier if he just told her what it said. And something about the quietness of it, the firelight, the sound of his voice working through centuries-old events, as if he were simply remembering things that had happened to someone he knew, which in a sense he was, had made the distance between what she felt and what she had said seem unnecessary. He had stopped reading. He had set the book down with great care, which was how he treated everything he valued. He had looked at her across the desk with those grey storm eyes, and she had held his gaze because she meant it, and she was not afraid of it, and she had told the truth, and there was nothing complicated about that. "I love you," he had said, and the way he said it, not performing it, not testing it, just saying it as a statement of fact, the way he spoke about things he had verified completely, told her that it had been true for considerably longer than this moment. "I know," she said. "You have known for a while." "Yes." "You were waiting for me to say it first." "No," she corrected gently. "I was waiting until it was right for me to say it. The timing of what you said is your own." He had come around the desk, and she had stood up to meet him, and he had held her face in his hands the way he had done at the ratification ceremony, with that same absolute certainty, and said her name once, just Amara, just the word. Quiet and precise and completely without distance. She had kissed him first that time the new year arrived, and with it the second renewal of the compact's terms, which was a much simpler negotiation than the first, because both parties came to it in good faith and with a year's worth of data demonstrating that what they had built was working. She added 3 clauses. He proposed 2 modifications. They argued pleasantly about the language of the 4th article for 2 hours over dinner in the court's private dining room, and reached a compromise that was, they both privately agreed, better than either of their original proposals. Zephyrin signed the ratification as required under the council's obligations, and his signature was neat and correct, and completely without warmth, which was fine. She had not built this for his warmth. She had built it because it was the right thing to build, because her father had seen the shape of it before he died, and had not had enough time, because the world was larger than conventional terms, and she had always known that, and had waited, without fully knowing she was waiting, for the part of the world that matched the largest version of herself. On the evening of the compact's second ratification, after the ceremony and the formal reception, and the point at which the court had dispersed, and the candles had burned lower, and the garden was frost-white under the winter moon, Balthazar found her in the music room. She was sitting at the piano. She did not play, had never learned, but she sat at it sometimes because she liked the feel of the keys under her hands, the potential of the instrument, the sense that something was there to be made. He came and sat beside her on the bench, which was more comfortable for 2 people than it looked. 2 years ago, he said, your father was alive and you had no knowledge that this court existed. 2 years and 4 months, she corrected. 2 years and 4 months, he agreed. A pause. And now you have rewritten the oldest legal document in the Valemont court's history, dismantled a faction that has been a threat to this court since the 18th century, and become, by any reasonable assessment, the most influential mortal affiliate in the court's modern history. Flattery. Fact. His voice was warm in the particular way it was warm when he was choosing not to modulate it. I have been alive for 6 centuries. Amara. I have watched arrangements that were meant to be partnerships become something else. I have watched the compact's mortal partners grow into the arrangement or be diminished by it or fail to understand it entirely. I have never. He stopped, and the stopping was characteristic, the careful choosing of words. I have never wanted any of it to be something different until now. Until me, she said. Until you. She looked at the piano keys under her fingers, white and black and silent. My father would have been very pleased with all of this, she said. Not just the compact, everything. She paused. He believed that the things worth protecting are the things worth building something around. He built the company around his family. He rebuilt the compact for the same reason. He would have looked at this, at you, at the court, at everything we've made, and he would have said, yes, that is the correct shape of it. Your father was a very intelligent man. Yes, she turned to look at him. He also would have had an absolutely enormous number of questions about vampire physiology that you would have found deeply invasive. Balthazar's expression shifted into the dry, oblique register of the humor he kept for moments when something had genuinely caught him off guard. I am sure I am going to ask them eventually anyway. I am certain you are. She laughed. And then she was leaning against him, her head against his shoulder, and his arm was around her, and the music room was still and warm, and outside the winter held everything in its cold, clean grip, and inside the fire burned, and the compact was ratified, and the threat was ended, and her father's work was finished by her in a form he would have recognized and been proud of. Play something, she said. You are here. I am always here now. Play anyway. There was a pause, and then his hands moved to the keys, and the music that came out was not something formal or performed. It was quieter than that, something he played from memory or instinct, notes that moved through the room the way candlelight moves, without urgency, without a destination more specific than the next phrase, the next measure, the next moment of something true. She listened, and he played, and the compact was ratified, and the world outside continued in all its mortal and immortal complexity, and inside the court on Mayfair's silent street, between the human heiress who had rewritten the ancient vow on her own terms and the vampire lord who had been waiting 6 centuries for something worth choosing freely, something that was not contractual and not political and not strategic in any calculable way, continued to grow, patient, certain, rooted deep in the only thing that had ever made either of them genuinely unafraid. Spring came back the way it always does, indifferent to the politics of either world, pushing green through stone, pulling birds back into the walled garden where Amara had started planting things in the beds along the south wall. Balthazar had watched this development with visible curiosity and had, after 2 weeks of watching her arrive in the garden with soil-covered gloves and an expression of fierce satisfaction when something grew correctly, asked her what she was planting. Roses along the wall, she said. Herbs in the center beds, some things that will take years to establish but will be extraordinary eventually. He had been quiet for a moment. You are planting things that will take years. She had looked up at him, understanding the implication. I am planting things that will take years, she confirmed. He had crouched beside her in the garden and helped her with her second rose cane, which he had done with the same meticulous care he brought to documents and decisions, and which had made her love him in a sharp and specific way that she suspected was available only to people who had seen someone do something unexpected and gentle with complete unself-consciousness. The roses, by spring's end, were establishing, by summer, when the court's walled garden was unexpectedly, riotously alive with things she had put there. She had begun to think more specifically about the conversation they had agreed to return to eventually. She was not 28 anymore. She was, in the strange arithmetic of a life that had moved very fast and very fully since March of the year her father died, somewhere different. Not different in age, but different in the more important measure. The one that has to do with knowing what you want and being willing to choose it with full knowledge of the cost. She chose a morning to have the conversation, deliberately, because mornings were a time that was hers, and not primarily the court's, and because the choice she was making had to be made in the light and not in the fire and candlelight register of the court's natural hours. Balthazar could manage dawn. He could not manage full daylight, and he did not pretend he could, but the early blue light of a June morning was manageable. And they sat in the walled garden with the roses coming into their first full bloom, and she told him that she wanted to discuss the conversion, seriously and specifically, when he was ready to explain what it actually involved. He explained it completely, and without any attempt to make it sound simpler or more comfortable than it was. The process, the risks, the changes, what would remain the same and what would not. He told her the things that were advantages and the things that were losses, because she had always said she wanted full information and he had always given it. She listened. She asked every question she had. He answered all of them. Then she said, "Not yet, but I understand it now, and I am not afraid of it." He had looked at her in the blue morning light with an expression she had not seen on him before, and which she thought, with the careful precision she trusted most, was relief. The specific relief of someone who has been afraid, for a very long time, of being the reason someone lost something they could not get back, and who has just been told, credibly, and by someone they trust completely, that the choice belongs to the person making it and not to the fear. "When you are ready," he said. "When I am ready," she agreed. The summer passed in its fullness, and the compact entered its second year of extraordinary operation, and the Sable Company continued its transformation under her hand, and Sebastian continued to ask her questions about the mortal world that she continued to answer with complete honesty and occasional mild exasperation, and the music room continued to hold its late-night concerts that were no longer in any way secret, and the garden grew. She turned 31 in August, and the court did something she had not expected. It celebrated, which apparently was not a traditional feature of vampire court culture for mortal affiliates, but which Sebastian had organized with assistance from 3 staff members who liked Amara for their own reasons, and had decided that the occasion warranted deviation from convention. The gathering was small and warm and genuinely joyful in a way that felt different from ceremonial occasions. Less formal, more honest, more itself. She had stood in the middle of it looking at the room, Sebastian, and 3 court members who had shifted from careful neutrality to something approaching genuine warmth over the preceding 2 years, and her own assistant from Sable Tower who knew the truth and had taken it on with the same practical competence she brought to every challenge, and thought about her father, who would have laughed at the strange and perfect shape of the life his death had, in part, built. And she thought about the woman who had walked into the court's inner sanctum with a document on modern paper and laid it on an obsidian altar and said, "I have terms," and had not flinched, and had not backed down, and had ultimately changed the oldest vow in the Valemont court's history, not by defying it, but by making it into something better. Balthazar found her standing at the garden door near the end of the evening, looking out at the August night, and he stood beside her the way he stood beside her in every room, close, certain, deliberately present. "Happy?" he asked. She considered the word. Not superficially, she gave it its full weight, the way she gave everything its full weight. The compact, rebuilt and functioning. The company clean and growing, her father's death, not undone, never undone, but answered. The court, changed and changing. The garden, blooming, the man beside her. 6 centuries of complexity and care and absolute loyalty, and the kind of love that does not need to perform itself because it has been too thoroughly proved. "Yes," she said. "Completely." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the August night was warm, and the roses were in full bloom, and somewhere inside the court, the piano waited in the music room, and the fire burned in the library, and the ancient vow, rewritten on her terms, held everything together the way a foundation holds a house, Unseen, essential, built to last. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that my grandfather was wrong about a lot of things, but the one he was most wrong about was deciding that the things he could not explain were not worth taking seriously." She tilted her head up to look at him. "This is the most serious thing that has ever happened to me. Being here, she said. Being this. Choosing this," she paused. "Choosing you." His hand came up to her face, that careful, deliberate, utterly certain gesture that she knew now as well as she knew her own heartbeat. He kissed her softly, with the full weight of 6 centuries of accumulated knowledge about the difference between what is merely old and what is genuinely worth preserving. She kissed him back with everything she was, mortal, capable, unafraid, and entirely freely her own. The ancient vow stood renewed. The Sable name was safe, the threat was ended, the court was changed, and in the walled garden of a Georgian townhouse in Mayfair, under the stars of an August night, the heiress who had walked into the oldest court in London and refused to give ground held the hand of the man who had been waiting, in the patient way of immortal things, for exactly this, and understood that some vows are worth rewriting, not to diminish them, but to make them true.